Hello and welcome. Tonight's episode explores the hidden reality of life in service, the long hours, the silence, and the unseen endurance behind noble comfort. This is why being a servant in a noble house was a nightmare. If you appreciate thoughtful historical storytelling, please like and subscribe. It helps bring more forgotten stories to light. And write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from different corners of the world. Now, turn down the lights, take a breath, and step with me into another time. I served 30 years under a roof of polished cruelty. There's no other way to begin this accounting. I'm old now, my hands twisted like the roots of an oak that has weathered too many winters, and the house where I spent the better part of my life stands still, I'm told, though I shall never see it again. They say the great parlour remains unchanged, the Turkish carpet still soft beneath the feet of those who matter, the portraits still watching from their gilded frames. But the servants who kept that elegance alive, we are mostly gone now, dispersed like ash from a fire that burned too long. I write this testimony not for glory, for there is none to be found in service, nor for revenge, though God knows there were moments when such thoughts sustained me through the darkest hours. I write because silence has its own weight, and I have carried it long enough. What I witnessed, what I endured, what we all endured in those corridors and kitchens and cellars, it deserves to be spoken, even if only to the empty air of this small room where I now sit, free at last, and terribly alone. My name does not matter. In service, names are given and taken away with equal ease. I was called by whatever suited the moment, girl. You there, the new one, the clumsy one, eventually just the housemaid, as though I were a position rather than a person. Perhaps that is what I became. Perhaps that is what we all became. The year was 1693 when I first passed through the servants' entrance of Hartwell Manor, a girl of 14 with nothing to my name but the dress I wore and a letter of character from the vicar's wife, who had taught me to read and write, skills that would prove both blessing and curse in the years to come. The manor stood in Oxfordshire, 3 stories of honey-coloured stone with more windows than I could count, surrounded by gardens that required 6 men to maintain and parkland that stretched beyond what my country eyes could comprehend. It was April, and the cherry trees along the drive were in bloom, petals drifting across the gravel like snow in spring. I thought it the most beautiful place I had ever seen. I was a fool. Beauty, I would learn, is often cruelty's favourite disguise. The housekeeper who interviewed me in the stone-flagged corridor outside the kitchen was called Mrs. Garrison. She was not married. The title was one of respect, granted to housekeepers regardless of their state, and she wore black bombazine that rustled when she moved, the sound of authority made audible. Her face was the colour of tallow, her eyes pale and assessing. She looked at my hands, at my teeth, at the way I stood, and I understood that I was being evaluated as one might evaluate a horse at market. She asked me 3 questions. Could I rise before dawn? Could I keep my tongue still? Could I obey without question? I answered yes to all 3 because I had no choice. My father had died of a fever the previous winter, and my mother, left with 4 younger children and no means of support, had been forced to seek aid from the parish. When the vicar's wife offered to secure me a position in service, it was understood that refusal was impossible. I would go to Hartwell Manor, I would send my wages home, and I would be grateful for the opportunity. Gratitude was the first lesson of service. We were to be grateful always, for the roof above our heads, for the food in our bellies, for the very air we breathed within those walls. Never mind that we earned our keep 1,000 times over. Never mind that we rose in darkness and collapsed in darkness and rarely saw the sun. Never mind that we were worked until our bodies screamed and our spirits grew numb. We were the fortunate ones, we were told. We had positions, we had employment, we had places. Mrs. Garrison led me through passageways that seemed to fold in upon themselves, narrow corridors lit by what little daylight filtered through high windows filmed with dust. The walls were whitewashed, the floors uneven stone. This was the hidden architecture of the house, the veins and arteries that allowed the body to function while remaining invisible to the eye. Here, there were no Turkish carpets, no paintings, no decorative plasterwork. Only function, only labour, only us. The servants' quarters occupied the attic floor, a warren of small rooms beneath the eaves where the summer heat gathered like a punishment and the winter cold crept through every gap in the ancient tiles. I was given a space barely larger than a coffin, with a narrow bed, a chamber pot, and a hook on the wall for my spare dress, assuming I should ever possess such luxury. 2 other housemaids shared the adjacent room, their presence announced by whispers and the creak of floorboards. I would come to know them well, though I cannot say we ever truly knew each other. Service has a way of making strangers of those who live in closest quarters. Mrs. Garrison explained my duties in a voice devoid of warmth. I would rise at 5 o'clock each morning when the bell rang. I would dress in darkness, quickly and quietly, and present myself in the kitchen for my first tasks. I would clean the grates in the family's bedchambers before they woke, laying new fires and removing the previous day's ash without making a sound. I would carry hot water for washing. I would empty chamber pots. I would sweep, dust, polish, scrub. I would move through the house like a ghost, completing my work before the family descended for breakfast, my presence erased as thoroughly as the dust I removed. I would eat twice daily breakfast at 6:30 after the family's morning rooms were prepared, dinner at 2 in the afternoon in the servants' hall, supper at 9 if there was time. My wages would be £3 per annum, paid quarterly, with £2 deducted for my uniform. I would have 1 half-day off each month to be taken at Mrs. Garrison's discretion. I would attend chapel every Sunday morning. I would speak only when spoken to. I would look at the floor when family or guests passed. I would never, under any circumstances, address a member of the family directly unless addressed first. And I would remember, always, that I was replaceable. There were 43 servants in Hartwell Manor when I arrived. I counted them during my first week, trying to understand the intricate hierarchy that governed our world. At the top stood Mr. Chetwin, the butler, a man of perhaps 50 years whose authority was absolute below stairs. His word was law. His disapproval was devastating. He moved through the house with the bearing of a bishop, his livery immaculate, his white gloves spotless even after a day's labour. He served the family directly, overseeing the dining room, the wine cellar, the male servants. His position was one of privilege. He had his own room, his own chair by the kitchen fire, his own knife and fork that no one else dared touch. Mrs. Garrison ruled the female servants with similar authority. Below her came the lady's maid, Miss Pettigrew, who served the mistress of the house and occupied a position of peculiar isolation, too elevated to fraternize with common servants, too lowly to sit at the family's table. Then the cook, Mrs. Talbot, who commanded the kitchen with more genuine power than many ladies command their drawing rooms. The first footman, the second footman, the groom of the chambers, the still-room maid, the laundry maids, the kitchen maids, the scullery maids, descending in strict order of precedence, each one knowing their place with the certainty of soldiers in formation. I was at the bottom. Below me only the scullery maid and the girl who turned the spit in the kitchen. We were the invisible ones, the ones who touch the filth so that others need not. We had no livery, no privileges, no prospects beyond the dim hope that we might, through years of silent service, rise to become upper housemaids, perhaps eventually a lady's maid if fortune and favour aligned. Most never rose at all. Most simply endured until their bodies gave out or they left to marry, trading one form of servitude for another. Would you have accepted such terms? Would you have bowed your head and called it opportunity? I did, because the alternative was the workhouse, or worse, the streets where girls without families disappeared into darkness and were never spoken of again. Service, no matter how harsh, offered protection. It offered walls and food and the thin veneer of respectability. It offered survival. And so I bowed my head. The first weeks passed in a blur of exhaustion and confusion. I woke in darkness to the clanging bell that shattered sleep, dressed with numb fingers, and stumbled down the narrow back stairs to the kitchen, where the range was already roaring, and the cook's assistant was stirring a pot of porridge that would feed 43 mouths before the sun rose. I ate standing, too tired to taste the food, then collected my pail and brushes, and began the long climb to the family's chambers. The house revealed itself slowly, room by room, corridor by corridor. The back passages where servants moved were a different world entirely from the grand spaces where the family lived. We travelled through narrow halls and steep staircases, through passages so low that even I had to duck, through doorways disguised as wall panels that opened onto magnificent rooms where the ceilings soared 15 feet high and the morning light poured through tall windows onto furniture that cost more than I would earn in a lifetime. I learned to move in silence, to open doors without sound, to walk without footsteps, to breathe without notice. I learned to make myself small, to fold my presence away until I was nothing more than a pair of hands performing their function. This was the art of service, to be essential and invisible simultaneously, to be everywhere and nowhere, to see everything and remember nothing. The family consisted of Lord Ashworth, his wife Lady Catherine, and their 3 children, 2 daughters of marriageable age, and a son away at Cambridge, who appeared only during the holidays. Lord Ashworth was a man of 60, a member of Parliament whose political ambitions had long since calcified into comfortable self-importance. He was tall, heavy in the way of men who eat well and move little, with a face that gravity had pulled into permanent disapproval. His voice carried through the house, even when he meant to whisper, a rumbling bass that demanded attention and obedience in equal measure. Lady Catherine was his second wife, some 20 years his junior, and it was said, though never in front of Mrs. Garrison, that she had married him for his title and fortune, having been the daughter of a wealthy merchant whose money could buy entrance to society but not respect. She was handsome rather than beautiful, her face carefully maintained with creams and powders, her figure corseted into fashionable shape. She spent her mornings writing letters, her afternoons receiving visitors, and her evenings at cards or the theatre. I do not think I ever saw her smile with genuine warmth. Her smiles were performance, calculated and displayed like her jewellery. The daughters, Miss Ashworth and Miss Eleanor, were 18 and 16 respectively, and they lived in a state of perpetual preparation for marriage, their days consumed with lessons in music and dancing and deportment, their evenings spent at assemblies and dinners where eligible gentlemen might be displayed before them like goods at market. Miss Ashworth was the beauty, with her mother's dark hair and a figure that drew male attention with gratifying regularity. Miss Eleanor was plainer, quieter, given to reading when she should have been perfecting her needlework. She would prove the more interesting of the two, though I did not know it then. I saw them only in glimpses during those first weeks. A rustle of silk disappearing around a corner. A voice raised in complaint about the temperature of washing water. The back of a head bent over embroidery in the morning room. They existed in a realm so distant from mine that we might have lived in different countries, though only the thickness of walls and the weight of class divided us. The work consumed everything. My hands, unused to such labour, blistered and bled within the first week. The lye soap we used for scrubbing ate at my skin until it cracked and wept. My knees, pressed against cold stone floors hour after hour, turned purple with bruises. My back ached from carrying water up 3 flights of stairs, from stooping to polish baseboards, from bending over washtubs in the laundry, where the steam left me dizzy and gasping. At night I fell onto my narrow bed still wearing my dress, too exhausted to undress, and slept without dreams until the bell rang again in darkness. There was no gentleness in that house, no softness. Mistakes were met with sharp reprimands that could reduce a girl to tears, and tears were met with contempt. We were not children to be coddled, but workers who must perform or be replaced. When Sarah, one of the other new housemaids, dropped a china teacup while dusting the drawing room, it slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered on the parquet floor. Mrs. Garrison deducted the cost from her quarterly wages and assigned her to chamber pot duty for a month as additional punishment. The humiliation was the point, the reminder that we were powerless. Yet within this harsh world, small mercies appeared. The cook, Mrs. Talbot, would sometimes slip an extra piece of bread to the younger servants, or allow us to scrape the bowl after she had made a syllabub for the family's dessert. The head groom, a man called Davies, who had worked at Hartwell since his own boyhood, would nod to us when we passed in the yard, a tiny acknowledgement of our shared humanity. And there was Agnes, the upper housemaid who slept in the room next to mine, who taught me how to remove candle wax from wood without leaving a mark, how to lay a fire so it would catch quickly, how to move through the house efficiently to conserve my strength. Agnes had been at Hartwell for 7 years. She was 22, ancient by the standards of service, and she had survived by learning to anticipate needs before they were spoken. She knew which floorboards creaked and how to avoid them. She knew that Lady Catherine preferred her chocolate lukewarm rather than hot, that Lord Ashworth would fly into rage if his newspaper was not pressed and dried before breakfast, that Miss Eleanor liked her curtains drawn back the moment she woke, while Miss Ashworth preferred dimness until her maid had prepared her for the day. Agnes moved through her duties with the efficiency of long practice, and I watched her with something approaching awe. She was the one who explained to me about the listening places. Every house has them, the spots where sound carries in unexpected ways, where a conversation in one room can be heard clearly in another through some trick of architecture or ventilation. In Hartwell Manor, there was a spot in the linen closet on the second floor where sound from Lord Ashworth's study rose through a heating vent, every word as clear as if one stood in the room itself. There was a passage behind the drawing room where servants waited to bring tea, and if you stood very still near the door panel, you could hear everything spoken within. The servants' staircase that ran behind Lady Catherine's bedchamber carried sound down 3 flights, so that her conversations with her maid could be heard by anyone climbing the stairs, though no one ever acknowledged this. We were not meant to listen, of course. We were meant to be deaf to the private business of the family, to pass through rooms where confidential matters were discussed, as though we had no ears, no memories, no minds capable of comprehension. But sound does not respect the boundaries of class, and servants hear everything eventually. We heard the arguments about money, about politics, about the children's marriages. We heard Lady Catherine weeping in her chamber after Lord Ashworth spoke harshly to her at dinner. We heard Miss Ashworth laugh with her maid about the shortcomings of her suitors. We heard the son, during his Christmas visit, drunkenly confess to his father that he had accumulated gambling debts that must be quietly settled. We heard, and we said nothing. Silence was survival. Speaking was dismissal or worse. But knowledge has weight. Even unspoken, even unacknowledged, it accumulates like dust in corners, like ash in grates. We carried their secrets as we carried their water, their meals, their waste. We knew them in ways they could never know us, because they never looked closely enough to see that we were watching. The first time I saw true cruelty was in my 3rd month at Hartwell. There was a scullery maid called Betty, a girl of perhaps 12 years, small for her age and simple in understanding. She had been hired from the parish poorhouse, where such children were sent when their families could not keep them. Betty worked in the kitchen, washing dishes and pots from dawn until after dark, her hands perpetually red and wrinkled from the hot water. She was a cheerful child despite her circumstances, humming little tunes while she worked, and this cheerfulness seemed to irritate Mrs. Talbot, who believed that contentment indicated insufficient labour. One morning, Betty broke a serving platter. It was an accident. She had been rushing to clear the breakfast things, and the platter slipped from her wet hands. The crash brought Mrs. Garrison from her sitting room, and Mr. Chetwin from the butler's pantry. They stood over the shattered porcelain while Betty trembled, her face white with fear. The punishment was decided quickly. Betty would receive no dinner for 3 days. She would work an additional 2 hours each evening after the other servants had finished, and she would sleep in the root cellar rather than the servants' quarters, so that she might reflect on the cost of carelessness. I watched as they led her away, this child who had worked herself to exhaustion for the privilege of sleeping on a pallet in the attic, who had never known kindness or comfort, who had smiled despite everything because she knew nothing else. They took her down the stone steps to the cellar where the potatoes and turnips were stored, where the temperature hovered just above freezing and rats scratched in the darkness, and they locked the door behind her. She cried that first night. We could hear her through the floorboards, a thin wailing that made sleep impossible for those of us whose conscience had not yet been entirely deadened by service. The second night, she was quiet. The third night we heard her coughing, a wet sound that carried through the house like prophecy. When they brought her back up on the 4th morning, she was fevered and shaking. Mrs. Garrison sent her immediately back to work. There was breakfast to prepare, dishes to wash, labour that could not wait for illness. Betty lasted until midday before she collapsed over the wash tub. They carried her to the attic and left her in bed with a blanket and a cup of water. No physician was called. Physicians cost money, and Betty was not worth the expense. She died 3 days later, her lungs filled with inflammation, her body too weak from hunger and cold to fight the sickness. The parish coffin came for her at dawn. I watched from the kitchen window as they loaded her small body onto the cart, wrapped only in the sheet from her bed. No one from the family attended. No one spoke words over her grave. She disappeared as though she had never existed, and that afternoon a new scullery maid arrived to take her place. That was when I understood the true nature of service. We were not members of a household, despite the gentle fiction that we were all part of one great family. We were tools, to be used until we broke and then replaced without ceremony or regret. Our lives had value only in relation to our utility. Once that utility ended, we became nothing. Less than nothing, an inconvenience to be disposed of as efficiently as possible. I thought of leaving after Betty died. I lay awake in my narrow bed and imagined walking down the drive, following the road wherever it led, finding some other life beyond these walls. But where would I go? I had no money. My wages went directly to my mother, who needed them for my siblings' survival. I had no skills beyond service. I had nowhere to run except toward the same fate that had claimed Betty, the slow, grinding poverty that consumed the poor like a fire that never quite manages to burn clean but only chars, slowly, over years. So I stayed. What choice did I have? The seasons turned. Summer came, and the house grew stifling under the eaves where we slept. I learned to work through exhaustion, to ignore the pain in my back and knees, to become the invisible ghost they required. I learned the geography of Hartwell completely, every room, every passage, every corner, where one might rest unseen for 30 seconds before the next task demanded attention. I learned to read the moods of those above me, to sense when Mrs. Garrison was looking for fault, when Mr. Chetwin was nursing grievances that would be taken out on the nearest servant, when the family was in residence or away, and how that affected the rhythm of our days. Autumn brought the hunting season, and with it a parade of guests who filled the house with noise and demands. Extra servants were hired for the duration girls from the village, who came for the season and left when it ended, their presence disturbing the careful hierarchy we had established. The work doubled, tripled. We rose at 4 rather than 5 to prepare rooms, to heat water, to lay breakfast for 20 rather than 7. We fell into bed near midnight and rose again before dawn, our bodies running on something beyond exhaustion, some place where thought ceased and only motion remained. It was during that autumn that I first experienced the recurring dream that would haunt me for the rest of my time at Hartwell. I walked through corridors that stretched longer with each step. Doors lined both walls, dark wood with brass handles that gleamed in candlelight, though I carried no candle. The doors opened and closed without my touching them, revealing glimpses of rooms beyond perfectly appointed chambers, with silk hangings and polished furniture, each one empty of people but full of presence, as though the air itself held the weight of those who had passed through. I walked and walked, trying to find the end of the corridor, but it simply continued, folding back on itself, leading me in circles, though I never passed the same door twice. Sometimes I heard voices behind the doors, laughter, weeping, whispered conversations I could almost but not quite understand. Sometimes I heard my own footsteps, though I made no sound. Sometimes I heard nothing at all, only the silence that has substance, that presses against the ears like water. I would wake gasping, my heart hammering, and for a moment I would not know where I was. Then the reality would settle back over me, the narrow bed, the cold room, the darkness before dawn, and I would realize that I had not escaped the corridors at all. I had only opened my eyes. Agnes told me that many servants had similar dreams. The house gets into your mind, she said. It becomes the only world you know. Your thoughts move through its rooms even when you sleep. There is no escaping it, not really. Even when you leave, and she had known servants who had left, had married or found other positions, they carried Hartwell with them. It remained inside them, like a sickness, a shape their lives had been pressed into that could not be unpressed. I wondered if I would carry it too when my time came to leave. If I would ever be free of these walls, these corridors, this weight of accumulated silence. Winter arrived, and with it came the particular hardships of service in an English manor house that prided itself on elegance but not on warmth. The family's rooms blazed with fires that we tended throughout the day and evening, but the servants' quarters and the back passages remained brutally cold. We woke in rooms where our breath frosted the air, dressed in darkness with fingers too numb to manage buttons, and worked in conditions that left our hands chapped and bleeding. Chilblains afflicted us all, painful swellings on fingers and toes that itched and burned. Some of the older servants developed coughs that never quite left them, a rattle in the chest that worsened each winter, until eventually it killed them, though no one spoke of it in such direct terms. They simply grew weaker, and then one day they were gone. It was during that first winter that I began to truly understand the nature of secrets in a great house. The listening places that Agnes had shown me revealed more than simple domestic arrangements. From my position in the linen closet, I heard Lord Ashworth conduct business that I dimly understood must be illegal. Conversations about moving money in ways that avoided taxes, about land purchases made under false names, about payments to officials that ensured certain votes in Parliament went as desired. I heard him dictate letters to his secretary that detailed plans to evict tenant farmers whose rents were in arrears, turning families out into winter cold without concern for their survival. I heard him discuss his children's marriage prospects in terms of financial advantage, as though they were assets to be traded rather than human souls with desires of their own. I heard Lady Catherine speak to her maid about her marriage, about the loneliness of sharing a bed with a man who regarded her as a decorative possession rather than a companion, about the lovers she had taken discreetly carefully to fill the emptiness of her days, about the powders she took to help her sleep, to calm her nerves, to make the endless round of social obligations bearable. Her maid would murmur sympathetically, and I could hear in those murmurs the complex transaction taking place, the maid offering comfort in exchange for favour, both women understanding that their relationship was ultimately one of utility despite its veneer of intimacy. I heard Miss Eleanor confess to her sister that she did not wish to marry, that she found the very thought of it terrifying and repulsive, that she would rather live quietly, perhaps as a companion to some elderly lady, than subject herself to the marriage bed and the endless round of pregnancy and childbirth that was a wife's expected duty. Miss Ashworth had laughed at her, called her foolish and unnatural, reminded her that marriage was the only respectable future available to women of their station. What else could she possibly do? Become a governess, a paid companion, reduce herself to the level of a servant? The very idea was absurd, and I heard things that frightened me, that I wished I had not heard, that made me understand the danger of knowledge without power. There was an incident in December, just before Christmas, that I understood only in fragments. A young woman arrived at the servants' entrance late one evening, accompanied by an older woman who might have been her mother or her keeper. They were brought into the house through the back passages and taken to a small room on the third floor, far from the family's chambers. A physician was summoned, not the family's usual physician, but another man, whose arrival was timed for late night when the family was at dinner and the servants distracted with their own meal. I saw the young woman only once by chance when I was carrying linens up the back stairs. She was perhaps 17, pale as milk, her eyes enormous with fear. She saw me, and our gazes met for a brief moment, and in that moment I recognized something, a plea, perhaps, or a warning, or simply a reflection of my own powerlessness staring back at me. Then the older woman pulled her away, and the door closed. 3 days later, they were gone. The room was cleaned thoroughly, the bed linens burned rather than washed, and the matter was never spoken of. But I knew, we all knew, those of us who moved through the hidden passages of the house. We knew that something had occurred in that room, some private transaction that powerful families conducted in darkness, some ending of an inconvenient beginning. What was I to do with such knowledge? Who could I tell? And even if I told, who would believe a housemaid over a member of Parliament? Who would care about the fate of an anonymous young woman whose very presence had been erased as thoroughly as Betty's? I said nothing. I carried the knowledge silently, added it to the accumulating weight of secrets that bent my back, more surely than the pails of water I carried upstairs. This is what service does to you. It makes you complicit in things you cannot prevent. It forces you to witness and remain silent. It teaches you that survival depends on blindness, on deafness, on a careful cultivation of ignorance, even when knowledge burns in your mind like acid, would you have spoken? Would you have risked everything, your position, your safety, your family's survival, to expose truths that the world did not wish to hear? I doubt it. For all our fine talk of morality and justice, most of us choose survival when the choice is presented. Most of us bow our heads and carry on, because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. The years passed in a rhythm that was both monotonous and unpredictable. The seasons turned, each one bringing its own particular hardships and small pleasures. Spring meant thorough cleaning of the house, every room stripped and scrubbed and aired, the carpets beaten until our arms ached and dust filled our lungs. Summer meant endless laundry, as the family changed their clothes multiple times daily to maintain freshness in the heat. Autumn meant the hunting season and its parade of guests. Winter meant frozen pipes and endless fires to tend, and the bone-deep cold of the servants' quarters, where we slept in our day clothes for warmth. I rose through the ranks, slowly. After 2 years, I became an upper housemaid. My wages increased to £4 per annum. After 4 years, I was given responsibility for the family's bedchambers, a position of relative trust that meant I handled their most intimate possessions, saw them in states of undress and vulnerability, knew which of them wept in private and which slept peacefully. After 6 years, I was offered the position of lady's maid to Miss Eleanor, who had not yet married despite her family's efforts, and who had specifically requested me for reasons I did not fully understand. This promotion changed the nature of my service. I moved from the attic to a small room adjacent to Miss Eleanor's chambers. I no longer ate in the servants' hall, but took my meals on a tray in my room. I had my own livery, paid for by the family black wool dresses with white collars and cuffs, a measure of distinction that separated me from the lower servants. My duties narrowed but intensified. I existed now for one person only, responsible for her clothing, her hair, her comfort, her secrets. Miss Eleanor was 23 by then, considered perilously close to spinsterhood. She had rejected 3 marriage proposals, much to her mother's horror and her father's irritation. She read constantly novels and poetry and philosophical works that ladies were not supposed to understand, and she had a sharp intelligence that made her difficult company for the vapid young men who were paraded before her at assemblies. She spoke to me directly, asked my opinions on small matters, treated me with a courtesy that was almost friendship, though we both understood the immense gulf that separated us. I did not trust her kindness. Kindness from those above was always conditional, always a test or a manipulation. But I performed my duties with care, and I observed her closely, trying to understand what she wanted from me beyond the obvious services of a lady's maid. It took me several months to realize that Miss Eleanor was lonely, desperately, achingly lonely in a way that I, surrounded by other servants even in isolation, could barely comprehend. She lived in a world where every word was weighted, every action observed, every feeling required to conform to the expectations of society. She could not speak freely to her family, who would have been scandalized by her thoughts. She could not speak freely to her peers, who were competitors in the marriage market and potential sources of scandal. She had no true friends, only acquaintances with whom she performed the rituals of sociability. And so she spoke to me, not as one speaks to a servant, but as one speaks to a diary, to a confessor, to the walls themselves when isolation becomes unbearable. She told me about the young woman who had visited the house that winter night 6 years earlier. She told me the truth I had already guessed, that the girl had been her brother's lover, that she had been with child, that the child had been removed by the physician in that third-floor room. She told me that her brother had returned to Cambridge without ever seeing the girl, that Lord Ashworth had paid the older woman a substantial sum for her discretion, that the girl herself had been sent away with enough money to keep silent but not enough to live well. She told me this calmly, without emotion, as I brushed her hair before bed. Her eyes met mine in the mirror. "Do you judge us?" she asked. I said nothing. What could I say? That I had indeed judged them, that I carried my judgment like a stone in my chest, that I thought them monstrous in their callousness. I kept my face carefully neutral and continued brushing. "You think us cruel," she continued. "Perhaps we are. But you do not understand the weight of reputation. the way a single scandal can destroy not just one person, but an entire family. My brother was foolish, but must my sisters and I pay for his foolishness by becoming unmarriageable? Must my father lose his position in Parliament? Must we all be ruined because of one mistake? I understood her argument. I did not accept it, but I understood it. The preservation of family honour above all else, even above the life of an unborn child, even above the well-being of a young woman who had trusted where she should not have trusted. This was the logic of their world, the morality of those for whom power meant the ability to make their problems disappear. But understanding did not mean forgiveness, and my silence, which she took for agreement, or at least for comprehension, was not acceptance. It was simply the silence that servants learn to wear like armour, the silence that protects us from the consequences of speaking truth to power. Miss Eleanor seemed to take comfort from these one-sided conversations. She spoke to me about her reading, about ideas that excited or troubled her, about the hypocrisy she saw in the church and in society. She spoke about her terror of marriage, of being given over to a man who would own her legally and physically, who could beat her or rape her or confine her and face no consequences, because the law protected husbands above wives. She spoke about wanting something else, some other life, though she could not articulate what that life might look like because no model for it existed in her world. I listened, and I brushed her hair, and I maintained my silence. What advice could I give? I, who had even less freedom than she did, who had escaped one form of powerlessness only to embrace another. At least she had money, education, the protection of her class. I had nothing but my labour and my silence. The dream of corridors came more frequently in those years. I would walk through the endless passages, the doors opening and closing, and now I recognised the rooms beyond them, the family chambers I had cleaned for years, the drawing rooms and parlours and dining rooms where I had moved invisibly. But in the dream they were empty of people, and I understood that the house itself was the presence I had felt, that Hartwell Manor was not merely a building, but a living thing that consumed those of us within its walls, servant and master alike, each of us trapped in our respective corridors, each of us unable to find the door that would lead to freedom. I served Miss Eleanor for 6 years. I watched her age from 23 to 29, watched the marriage proposals cease, watched her settle into the role of spinster daughter who would remain at home to care for her aging parents. I watched her grow quieter, more withdrawn, the sharp intelligence that had made her interesting, slowly dimming into resignation. She took up charitable work, visiting the poor, distributing food and clothing, teaching reading to village children, and this became her life, this narrow channel of acceptable activity for an unmarried woman of her station. I wondered sometimes if she envied me, if she looked at my rough hands and worn face and simple life, and thought that at least I had the freedom to move through the world without constant observation, without the crushing weight of expectations that had no relation to my own desires. But I suspect she never thought of me in such terms. I was her maid, her confidant in moments of loneliness, but I was not quite real to her. None of us were quite real to them. In my 12th year at Hartwell, something happened that shattered the careful equilibrium I had maintained between observation and silence. There was a footman called Thomas, a young man of perhaps 22 who had been hired the previous year. He was handsome in a rough way, with dark hair and eyes that held a certain intelligence and humour. He was well liked among the servants, quick to help others with heavy work, ready with a joke that could ease the tedium of our days. He and Agnes, who was still an upper housemaid, had formed an attachment, nothing openly acknowledged, for romantic connections between servants were discouraged, but visible nonetheless in the way they found reasons to be near each other, in the glances they exchanged across the servants' hall. Thomas made a mistake. He was serving at dinner one evening when Lord Ashworth's son, home from Cambridge for the summer, made a comment about the quality of the wine. Thomas, in what he surely meant as helpfulness, suggested that perhaps the wine had been stored incorrectly, that he had noticed the cellar seemed warmer than usual due to an issue with ventilation. He should not have spoken. Servants do not offer opinions, do not suggest that anything in the household might be less than perfect, do not correct or contradict in any way. His words, though factually accurate, there was indeed a problem with the cellar ventilation, were impertinence of the highest order. Lord Ashworth went very still. Then he turned his full attention to Thomas, and I, standing against the wall ready to attend Miss Eleanor should she require anything, felt the temperature in the room drop, though no window had been opened. "What is your name?" Lord Ashworth asked, his voice terribly quiet. "Thomas, my lord." "Thomas Webb." "Thomas Webb, you have been in my service for 1 year. In that time, have I given you any indication that I value your opinions on the management of my household?" Thomas's face had gone pale. "No, my lord." "Then perhaps you can explain why you felt it appropriate to offer such an opinion at my dinner table, in front of my family and guests." There was no good answer. Thomas stammered something about only wishing to be helpful, and Lord Ashworth cut him off with a gesture. "You will pack your belongings tonight. You will leave this house at first light tomorrow. You will receive no character reference, and if I hear that you have sought employment in any household within 50 miles of here, I will personally ensure that you never work in service again." Just like that, Thomas's life was destroyed. Without a character reference, he could not find respectable employment. Without employment, he would slide inevitably toward poverty, toward the dangerous work that killed men slowly or quickly, toward the streets where those without prospects disappeared. One moment of speech, one attempt to be helpful, and he was cast out with less ceremony than one would dismiss a stray dog. Agnes wept that night. We all heard her through the walls, and no one went to comfort her, because we were all too frightened, too aware that we could be next, that any one of us could make a similarly innocent mistake and find ourselves homeless in a world that had no mercy for the fallen. Thomas left before dawn. I watched from my window as he walked down the drive carrying his small bundle of possessions, watched until he disappeared beyond the gates and the world swallowed him. I never learned what became of him. Perhaps he survived. Perhaps he found other work, another life. Perhaps he ended his days in a workhouse or a pauper's grave. There was no way to know, and we did not speak of him after he left. His name became forbidden, his presence erased from the household memory as thoroughly as if he had never existed. Agnes was never the same after that. She grew harder, more brittle, the small kindnesses she had once shown to younger servants drying up like water in drought. She had learned what I had learned years earlier with Betty's death. That attachment was dangerous, that caring left you vulnerable to pain that service inflicted constantly, and without mercy. Better to remain closed, distant, to build walls around whatever remained of your heart, and guard them carefully. I was 30 years old by then. I'd spent 16 years at Hartwell Manor, half my life given over to service. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger, a woman with grey already threading through her hair, with lines carved deep around her mouth from years of careful neutrality, with eyes that had learned to show nothing. My hands were permanently rough, the nails broken and discoloured despite the elevation of my position. My back ached constantly from years of heavy work. I had a cough that worsened each winter and never fully cleared even in summer. I had saved almost nothing. My wages had gone to my mother for years, supporting my siblings until they were old enough to work themselves. Then my mother had died, and the small amount I'd managed to keep had gone to ensure she had a decent burial, rather than a pauper's grave. I had no prospects beyond Hartwell, no skills that would translate to other employment, nowhere to go even if I wanted to leave. This was the trap of service. It consumed your youth, your health, your possibilities, and gave you nothing in return but survival. And survival, I had learned, was a smaller thing than I had once imagined. The dream of corridors changed in those years. Now, when I walked through the endless passages, I sometimes saw other figures' servants I had known who had died or left or simply disappeared. They moved through the rooms silently, performing tasks that needed no completion, trapped in eternal repetition of the motions that had defined their lives. I would try to speak to them, to ask if they had found some way out, but they never responded. They simply continued their work, polishing silver that was already gleaming, dusting furniture that held no dust, walking from room to room with the steady pace of those who have surrendered to the inevitability of their fate. I would wake from these dreams more exhausted than when I had fallen asleep, and I would rise to face another day identical to all the days before it, and I would wonder if this was all there was, if this would continue until my body gave out, and I became another ghost walking the corridors of Hartwell, never quite managing to leave even after death. It was in my 18th year of service that Miss Eleanor attempted to end her own life. I found her in her bedchamber on a Tuesday morning in March. I'd gone to wake her at her usual hour, carrying her morning chocolate on a silver tray, and when I entered the room I knew immediately that something was wrong. The air held a quality of stillness that was different from sleep, a weight that pressed against my chest. She lay in her bed with unusual rigidity, her face pale as the linens, her breathing so shallow it was nearly imperceptible. On the bedside table sat an empty vial that had contained the laudanum she took for headaches. Next to it, a note written in her careful hand. I did not read the note. I set down the tray and went immediately to find Mrs. Garrison, my mind strangely calm, moving through the steps of response as though I had rehearsed them. Mrs. Garrison sent for the physician and for Lady Catherine. The household erupted into controlled chaos, servants moving with swift efficiency to contain the crisis, to prevent word from spreading beyond the walls, to protect the family from scandal. The physician came. He administered treatments that made Miss Eleanor vomit, forcing the poison from her body. She survived, though whether this was mercy or cruelty I could not say. When she regained consciousness that evening, weak and disoriented, Lady Catherine was sitting beside her bed, and I stood in the corner where I always stood, present but invisible. Lady Catherine spoke softly, urgently. She spoke of family honour, of reputation, of the scandal that would destroy them all if word of this reached society. She spoke of Miss Eleanor's duty, of the shame she would bring upon her sisters if this became known. She did not speak of love. She did not ask what despair had driven her daughter to such extremity. She spoke only of consequences, of damage control, of the ways this crisis must be managed and concealed. Miss Eleanor said nothing. She stared at the ceiling with eyes that held no light, and I understood that something in her had broken beyond repair. The official story was that Miss Eleanor had suffered a severe illness, a fever that had left her weak and confused. She was confined to her chambers for 3 weeks while she recovered. No one outside the immediate household knew the truth, and those of us within the household knew better than to speak of it. The note disappeared. The vial disappeared. The entire incident was erased from official record as thoroughly as if it had never occurred. But I had seen. I carried the knowledge of what she had tried to do, of the despair that could drive someone with every material comfort to seek such permanent escape. And I understood, in a way I had not fully grasped before, that the corridors imprisoned us all. Servant and master alike, we were all trapped within these walls, all performing roles that had been written for us, all moving through lives that felt increasingly like the dream I dreamed night after night. Endless passages leading nowhere, doors opening onto rooms that offered no true destination. When Miss Eleanor recovered sufficiently to require my services again, she never mentioned that morning. She never acknowledged what had occurred. We resumed our previous dynamic. She spoke, I listened. We maintained the careful fiction of our roles. But something had shifted between us. She looked at me sometimes with an expression I could not quite read, something like recognition, or perhaps apology. And I looked back with my servant's face, neutral and attentive, revealing nothing of the pity and rage and helplessness that churned beneath my careful exterior. The years continued their march. Lord Ashworth died of apoplexy in my 22nd year at Hartwell. The household went into mourning, black crape draped over mirrors and portraits, the servants wearing black armbands, the family observing the elaborate rituals of grief that society demanded. I felt nothing at his death except a mild relief that I would no longer have to hear his voice carrying through the house, no longer have to witness the casual cruelty with which he had treated those beneath him. Lady Catherine became the dowager, and Lord Ashworth's son inherited the title and the estate. He was 35 by then, married to a woman from an old family whose bloodline compensated for her lack of beauty or charm. They had 3 children who would grow up as their father had, learning that servants were furniture that occasionally needed dusting. Miss Ashworth had married years earlier, wed to a baronet twice her age who provided the title her family craved. Miss Eleanor remained at Hartwell, now in her 40s, resigned to permanent spinsterhood, her charitable works the only occupation available to her. I continued to serve her, and we continued our strange dance of proximity and distance, intimacy and formality. I was 40 years old. My body was failing in small ways. My joints ached constantly. My hands trembled from old injuries and constant work. My eyesight was weakening. My cough had become a permanent companion. I knew that I was approaching the end of my usefulness. Soon I would be too old, too ill, too slow to perform my duties to the standard required. And then what? There was no pension for servants, no retirement, no safety net. When you could no longer work, you were simply cast out, left to survive as best you could on whatever you had managed to save, which for most of us was nothing. I began to understand why some servants chose their own ending rather than face the slow decline into destitution. It was not cowardice, but a form of control, a final assertion of will in lives that had been defined by submission. I thought of Betty dying in the cold attic, of Thomas cast out for a moment's speech, of Miss Eleanor swallowing laudanum in desperation. I thought of all the servants I had known who had disappeared into workhouses, or onto the streets, or into unmarked graves, and I wondered if my own end would be any different. The dream of corridors took on new meaning. I understood now that the endless walking, the doors that opened onto empty rooms, the figures moving through their eternal tasks. This was not a dream, but a vision of truth. We were all walking through passages that led nowhere, all trapped in a system that ground us down and offered no escape except death. The corridors were real. They existed in every great house, in every church, in every institution that divided people into those who commanded and those who obeyed. And most of us walked them until we could walk no more. In my 28th year at Hartwell, Agnes died. She had continued working until the very end, even when the cough that had plagued her for years became constant, even when she grew so thin that her uniform hung loose on her frame. She refused to admit weakness, refused to stop, because stopping meant dismissal, and dismissal meant death slightly quicker than working herself to death. At least while she worked, she had a bed to sleep in and food to eat, even if she could barely swallow it. She collapsed in the corridor outside the linen closet where we had first spoken of secrets and listening places, where I had learned to hear the private business of the family. I found her there in the afternoon, crumpled against the wall like a pile of discarded clothing. She was still breathing, but barely. I knelt beside her and took her hand, and she looked at me with eyes that had already seen beyond the walls of Hartwell. "Is there anything more," she whispered, "than this?" I wanted to tell her yes. I wanted to tell her that there was meaning and purpose and some reward for the decades she had spent in service. But I could not lie to her, not in that moment. So I said nothing, and I held her hand until the breathing stopped and she became still. They buried her in the servants' section of the churchyard, in an unmarked grave that would sink and settle and eventually disappear beneath the grass. All trace of her erased as thoroughly as her life had been erased from the household records. A new upper housemaid was hired the following week. Agnes's possessions, a few clothes, a comb, a small Bible, were distributed among the other servants or burned. Within a month, it was as if she had never existed. I stood at her graveside during the brief service, and I made a decision. I would not die at Hartwell. I would not become another ghost walking the corridors of that house. Whatever time I had left, however few years or months or days, I would spend them somewhere else, anywhere else. I would leave while I still had the strength to walk away. It took me 2 more years to gather the courage and the means. I saved every penny I could, hiding coins in a small bag under my mattress. I wrote letters to distant relations I barely knew, seeking any possibility of refuge. I made inquiries in the village about rooms to let, about work that a woman of my age and condition might find. The options were bleak, but they existed. Anything was better than staying. Miss Eleanor was the only one I told of my intention. She was 47 by then, her face lined with years of quiet disappointment, her spirit worn smooth by decades of submission to expectations she had never chosen. I told her one evening as I prepared her for bed, my hands moving through the familiar ritual of unpinning her hair, and I watched her face in the mirror as comprehension dawned. "You're leaving me," she said. It was not a question. "I must," I replied. "I cannot die here." She was silent for a long moment, and I continued brushing her hair, the same motion I had performed thousands of times over 16 years. "I envy you," she said finally. "You have the courage to leave." "You could leave too," I said, though we both knew it was impossible. She had money, education, connections, everything I lacked, but she was more trapped than I had ever been, because her chains were made of gold and expectation and the invisible bars of class and gender that no key could open. "Where would I go?" she asked, and her voice held such emptiness that I could not answer. I gave my notice to Mrs. Garrison the following week. She accepted it with cold disapproval, as though my leaving after 30 years was a personal betrayal. No character reference would be provided, she informed me, since I was choosing to leave rather than staying until I was dismissed. I had expected this. Character references were rewards for obedience, and choosing one's own path was the ultimate disobedience. My last day at Hartwell Manor was a Thursday in October, the year 1723. I woke before dawn for the final time in that narrow attic room, dressed in the same darkness I had dressed in 10,000 times before. I walked down the servants' stairs, through the passages I could have navigated blind, past the listening places where I had heard so many secrets, through the kitchen where the range already blazed with morning fire. No one gathered to say farewell. Servants came and went constantly, and sentiment was not encouraged. I walked down the drive carrying my small bundle of possessions, a change of clothes, the Bible my mother had given me, the bag of coins I had saved, and I did not look back at the house. I had spent enough of my life looking at Hartwell Manor. I had no desire to see it again. The village was 3 miles distant. I walked slowly, my body protesting the effort after 30 years of servitude had worn it down to something barely functional. But I walked, and with each step I felt the weight of the house lifting from my shoulders. The corridors were behind me, the endless passages, the doors opening and closing, the dream that had haunted my sleep for decades. I was leaving them behind. I took a room in the village, a tiny space above a chandler's shop that cost 6pence a week. I found work taking in washing, mending clothes, occasionally cleaning for the vicar's wife who remembered me from my childhood. The work was hard and the money barely sufficient, but it was mine. I chose it. I controlled the terms of my labour. For the first time in 30 years, I was not a servant. The corridors still visit me in dreams sometimes, even now. I wake in darkness, and for a moment I am back at Hartwell, trapped in those endless passages, walking and walking without destination. But then, I remember where I am. This small room, this narrow bed that belongs to me, this life that is mine to shape as I will within the limited options available to a woman alone and aging. And I understand that I am free, or as free as someone like me can ever be. Miss Eleanor wrote to me once, a brief letter that arrived 6 months after I left. She told me that the house felt emptier without me, that she missed our evening conversations, that she hoped I was well. She did not ask me to return. She understood, I think, that I had escaped something that she never could, and that whatever loneliness I faced in freedom was preferable to the slow death of service. She died 3 years later. I learned of it from the vicar, who mentioned it during a chance meeting in the village. "A fever," he said, though he looked uncomfortable when he said it, and I wondered if it had truly been fever, or if she had finally succeeded in the attempt she had made all those years ago. I hoped, for her sake, that she had found peace, though I doubted it. People like Miss Eleanor, born into comfort but trapped by it, rarely found peace in life or death. I'm 62 years old now. My body has mostly failed. My hands can barely hold a needle, my back is bent, my cough never ceases. I will not live much longer, and I am not sorry for it. I have outlived my usefulness, outlived my beauty if I ever had any, outlived my strength and my youth and most of my hope. But I have also outlived my servitude, and that is worth something. I think often about the question Agnes asked as she lay dying. Is there anything more than this? I still do not have an answer. Perhaps there is something beyond these lives we lead, some reward or meaning or purpose. Perhaps there is nothing. I do not know, and I have ceased to care greatly. What I know is this. I served for 30 years in a house that consumed everyone who entered it, servant and master alike. I witnessed cruelty and hypocrisy, and the slow grinding down of human dignity beneath the weight of class and power. I carried secrets that should have been exposed, and remained silent when I should have spoken. I survived when others did not, and I do not know if that makes me lucky or simply stubborn. but I left. In the end, when I could have stayed and died in service as so many did, I chose to leave. I walked away from the corridors, from the endless passages, from the dream that had no ending. And that choice, small as it was, narrow as my options were, was mine. No one gave it to me. No one granted it as a favour or reward. I took it, and in taking it, I reclaimed some small portion of the self that 30 years of service had slowly erased. This is my testimony. This is what being a servant in a noble house meant. Not the grandeur you might imagine, not the elegant dinners and beautiful rooms and refined company. Those things existed, but they existed for others. For us, service meant erasure. It meant becoming invisible while remaining constantly visible, becoming nothing while maintaining everything. It meant witnessing lives we could never live, maintaining standards we could never meet, upholding a system that ground us down and offered nothing in return but survival. Would you have done differently? Would you have refused, resisted, rebelled? I doubt it. Most of us do what we must to survive, and we call it choice because the alternative acknowledging that we had no choice at all is too terrible to bear. I served 30 years under a roof of polished cruelty, and when I finally left, I learned that freedom is smaller and harder and lonelier than I had imagined. But it is freedom nonetheless, and I would not trade it for all the comfort and security of servitude, not for anything in this world or the next. The corridors are behind me now, the doors have stopped opening and closing. The dream has finally ended, and I have woken to a morning that is mine alone. It is enough. It has to be enough. It is all I have, and perhaps, in the end, it is all any of us have, the small choices we make within the narrow confines of our circumstances, the tiny rebellions that assert our humanity, even when the world insists we have none. I chose to leave. I chose to speak this truth, to write this accounting of what service meant and what it cost. I chose to remember when it would have been easier to forget, to speak when silence would have been safer. These are small things, perhaps, but they are mine, and in a life defined by service to others, by the constant surrender of self to the needs and wants and whims of those who had power over me, these small acts of self-assertion are everything. I served, I survived, I left, I remembered. And now I have spoken. This is my testimony. Let it stand as witness to all those who served beside me, who died in service, who disappeared into the corridors and were never seen again. Let it stand as accusation against a system that treated human beings as tools to be used and discarded. Let it stand as proof that we existed, that we mattered, that our lives and our suffering and our small moments of joy and resistance were real. We were there. We saw everything. We knew everything. And though they tried to make us invisible, though they tried to erase us from memory and history, we were there. Remember us. Remember that the beauty and elegance and comfort you admire in those great houses was built on our backs, maintained by our labour, made possible by our erasure. Remember that behind every polished surface, every elegant dinner, every moment of aristocratic ease, there were dozens of us exhausted, exploited, enduring. Remember us, because we cannot afford to be forgotten again. This is my testimony, and it is finished.